You're listening to Innovators, the podcast from Harris Search Associates, where we speak with global leaders in education, research, engineering, and the health sciences, and ask them to share lessons learned as they continue to advance the frontiers of innovation and discovery. Today's podcast will be led by Rick Skinner, Senior Consultant.
Recently, Mississippi State's epidemiologist warned unvaccinated adults against taking a medicine used to deworm horses in order to fend off the coronavirus or as a treatment for the disease rather than be vaccinated. In 1997, The Lancet, one of the most prestigious medical journals, published an article in which the author, a physician researcher, suggested that the measles, mumps, rubella, MMR, vaccine was causing autism among British children. Despite the paper being discredited on numerous grounds, including a lack of rigor, and notwithstanding several subsequent major studies revealing no such link between the vaccine and autism, the article continues to be cited by public figures and a few doctors as evidence for avoiding childhood vaccination. The history of science extends back to Galileo and the Catholic Church challenge to science's authority, and runs through the 1925 Scopes trial and the teaching of evolution about the origins of the earth and human species, to claims today that the evidence for the efficacy of COVID-19 vaccines is questionable at best. Yet, within living memory, science and scientific research were embraced by the general public as the best way by which societies might fight and even eliminate age-old diseases that killed millions, made possible for man to journey into space and improve public health and extend life. What happened to change the authority of science and scientific research? Has it diminished over time, and if so, how and why? One observer suggested it is the nature of science itself that makes possible serious challenges to the method. The ugly truth, he says, is that science is more like Facebook, whose positive features are also vulnerabilities. Precisely because it allows us to connect and share, Facebook creates opportunities for misuse. Similarly, science is an exemplary form of inquiry because it is technical, fallible, done in communities, and able to reshape our values. But these very features allow detractors to reject the authority even of eminent experts. And the stakes involved in the authority of science and scientific research are not necessarily arcane or trivial. On Innovators today, we want to consider some of the issues and challenges associated with science and scientific research with Professor David B. Allison of Indiana University. Dr. Allison is Distinguished and Provost Professor and Dean of the School of Public Health. He earned a Ph.D. from Hofstra, then undertook 2 fellowships, one in the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, another with the New York Obesity Research Center. He then joined the faculty at Columbia University, after which he accepted appointment as endowed professor and director of the Nutrition Obesity Research Center at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. Dr. Allison was appointed dean of the Indiana University School of Public Health in 2017. He is an elected member of the National Academy of Medicine and was appointed to the Committee on Science and Technology Engagement with the Public of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Dr. Allison was recently chosen to co-chair and serve on a newly established Strategic Council for Research Excellence, Integrity, and Trust through the National Academy of Sciences. It was appointed to a new ad hoc committee convened by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine to develop methods for addressing misinformation about biological threats. Dean Allison has published more than 500 articles and books, and is among the leaders in the number of grants awarded him by the National Institutes of Health. Most recently, he has focused considerable attention on the matter of rigor in scientific research and brought to the subject extraordinary statistical and mathematical skills, experience with controversies surrounding sponsorship of research and the question of research bias, as well as very real concern that the authority of science is being undermined, not only by attacks from laypersons, but also a failure to adhere to the principles by which research is undertaken and publicized. Statements in a co-authored 2016 article in the journal Nature are suggestive of Dr. Allison's and his colleagues' concerns that science, quote, relies essentially but complacently on self-correction, and robust science needs robust corrections. It is time to make the process less onerous. Welcome to Innovators, Dr. Allison.
Thank you, sir. How are you today?
We're doing well. Thank you very much. I want to take up about 4 questions with you today that deal with this whole issue of science and the question of scientific authority. I guess I'll begin with the most obvious one, which is just how serious is the recent threat to the authority of science? What really is at stake when persons, some of great prominence, question the validity and reliability of findings from scientific research? I mean, after all, scientists themselves are trained to be generally skeptical of the outcomes of research, including and especially when the research is done by other scientists. And there have been episodes in American history when science was discounted substantially as a method for ascertaining facts. So is the threat stemming from challenges to science today any more dangerous than were attacks in the past? And if so, why? And are the stakes that much higher?
The stakes from the threats to science are sometimes high and sometimes trivial, and they have been present throughout the history of humanity and science. When we look back, the idea of anti-vaxxers, for example, or vitriolic controversies around vaccines is not new. If you look at the debates between Cotton Mather and Benjamin Franklin in the early days of Benjamin Franklin, he was an anti-inoculator, not an anti-vaxxer. That was pre-vaccines. But they were very controversial, and they were no more polite and friendly than our most vitriolic combatants are today. So that's not new. When you look at back to Ben Franklin, the lightning rod met with great consternation of people said, maybe God wants your house to be struck by lightning and burnt down. And if you put up a lightning rod, you're interfering with God's plans. So there have been many, many times throughout history. Giordano Bruno burnt at the stake, Galileo under house arrest for supporting Copernican theory. And we all know we could go on and on. So these are not new ideas. They will continue. They are not limited to vaccines or COVID-19 or masks or the present day. They will be there in the future. They've been there in the past. Sometimes those threats are trivial. And I think the threats tend to be trivial when the science is more of what one might call an engineering nature, and when it's more of something that's easily palpable and highly reliable. And an example would be development of a microwave oven or the development of an airplane. And we say the airplane works, the microwave oven works, and people want microwave ovens and they want airplanes. And so there's a general acceptance of the fruits of science and not a lot of question of the underpinnings. Now, then we have other situations in which things are not as easily palpable. People cannot always tell the value, positive or negative, of the preservatives in their food, of their vaccines, of their pharmaceuticals, of agricultural practices, of whether their crops are genetically modified by transgenic technology or not. That's where I think things get tricky. And sometimes the stakes are very high, as in, for example, when a genetically modified crop is rejected by a country that could feed many more millions of people who are otherwise poorly fed or starving. The stakes are very high. It's terrible, horrible loss of life by rejection of scientific knowledge. On the other hand, sometimes it's trivial because things go on, despite the fact that people don't understand a particular aspect of science. It doesn't really matter that much to practical life. Science keeps going on. So I think these things are very different.
I guess that leads me to ask you, the word palpability, I guess is the one that I'm on to very quickly. This fact that it's demonstrable, is that the key to this, that people can, that the public, an informed public, let's make this an informed public, that they're able to see and know for themselves what the impact of that particular scientific development is. Is that the crucial variable here?
I think that is a crucial variable. I don't know if I want to say it's the crucial variable, but that's right. You see that your iPhone works. You see that your computer works. You see that the plane takes off and gets you somewhere. And so for say, I accept this technology. It's a service I want or technique I want. I see that it works reliably, works almost every time. Whereas when you say, I've got this plant and the plant was modified by transgenic means, or I've got a vaccine and I don't know that I would or wouldn't have gotten something if I did or didn't have the vaccine, then I think it's not as immediately demonstrable, and then it leaves people more in doubt.
That suggests to me one of the reasons I've been noting a great deal is that even persons such as nurses, in many cases, especially those who are younger and who are of childbearing age, many of them have resisted this vaccine. And they've done so largely because they feel the way in which it came about and what they believe its potential damage to them and their children. They have been quite vocal about that to the point. So it's palpability and to some extent utility then. If people find something useful, they're more likely to agree to it. But you and your colleagues in various publications suggest that at least some part of the problem with science's question authority rests with the scientific community itself. You cite a lack of rigor, relaxed and unenforced accountability, and for a lack of a better way of expressing the problem, biases in the sorts of research and findings that get published, notwithstanding a plethora of editors, associate editors, and a roster of readers in a community that's not otherwise known for having a penchant for trends or fads. It's not some flavor of the day. Is it the case that the scientific community has become too vast, too diverse? It is already truly global in scope, very competitive. It's something we don't talk very much about. I know you have, but generally speaking, most people have avoided talking about the competitive pressures that organizations and institutions and individuals confront. And then there's the fact that you can publish something almost anywhere. There's always some outlet for your publication. That's the reason I was able to publish something that there's absolutely no standards at all in some cases. Is the fact of the matter is that what's happened, we've gone from being a small, relatively finite community of people who attended the same universities, were trained by the same mentors, converse and interact with one another regularly. That world's gone. And we have instead this world in which there's no lack of scientific, what is called scientific research. And the standards by which we hold people accountable have just gone out the window. Is it more a matter of the maturation and growth of the scientific community than anything else that sort of finds us in this state of uncertainty about how much we should trust science?
You have given me so much good stuff to work with. I appreciate that. So I want to touch on 4 major points, and I'm going to try to lay these out, see if I can remember them right now, so that if I don't touch on them all, that you'll prompt me. So one is the point is about, is there less trust in science, and what do we mean by that? The second point I want to touch on is failure of reproducibility, rigor, and transparency, and replicability in science. What causes it? What can we do about it? What the effects are. The third I want to touch on is whether things are really worse today than in the past. And then finally, the fourth I want to touch on is the idea of incentive systems and what one might almost call a business model for knowledge. So those are the 4 things. So if I don't hit all of them, you can remind me if you. So the first one is, what do we mean by lack of trust in science, and is there less trust? There has actually been some surveys of this, and the GSS takes a look at this. Susan Fisk has looked at this, and generally, actually, science and scientists are quite well trusted, and trust has not gone down very much in recent years and decades. Trust in Congress has always been low. You told me I shouldn't say anything bad about presidents, but I'll mention that. Congress has always been very, very low. Trust in media used to be higher and has sunk to very, very low levels. Trust in the military remains high and has even gone up a little bit in recent years. But trust in scientists stays very high, has stayed very high. So it really hasn't gone down all that much. Now, this is important when we say, what do we mean by the authority of science or scientists? And I think this is very complicated. I often hear, particularly among science community, the idea that the authority of science, or we have an anti-science trend, people don't believe in science. I think that is simply untrue. I think that is a false narrative. And I think what people mean is that what they, the mainstream elements of the scientific community, think of as the valid research and the valid ideas are not being trusted. And what they're saying is science is not being trusted. What I don't hear from the people who are pushing what I would say are unscientific ideas, they're not saying I reject science. They're not saying we want just mysticism or pull beliefs from faith only or pull beliefs randomly. They say we want science. The difference is who decides what's legitimate science. So when we say people aren't trusting science, do we mean they're not trusting the process of science? And I think the answer is no. I think people do trust the process of science as a way of coming to knowledge. Do we mean that they're not trusting specific bits of scientific knowledge? By the science, do we mean the canon of knowledge? And then I think the answer is yes. We do have people who are questioning the canon of knowledge. And why are they questioning some elements of scientific knowledge? And the reason is what's breaking down is not trust in scientists as a broad community. That is, we don't trust anybody who's called a scientist by definition. It's many people don't trust specific scientists. And the difficulty is not, the challenge is not in getting people to accept that science matters or that some scientists matter. It's figuring out which scientists, which scientific ideas are, quote, legitimate and trustworthy and which are not. And this is very, very difficult because as soon as you accept that, if I accept that this other person over here to my right, this hypothetical person, or to my left, this other hypothetical person, I don't mean right or left politically, that these individuals, like me, value science. They have beliefs, but we may trust different sources. If you ask me as a scientist who studies certain things, how do some things work? How does a randomized controlled trial work? I understand that very well. That's my strong suit. That's my area. If you ask me, how does a radio work? How is it that radio waves come into my house, into a device called a radio, and then come out as coherent words? So I don't exactly understand all of that, but I trust somebody that, you know, that they've got it worked out and it makes sense, right? But who do we trust? Some people trust Anthony Fauci and the NIH. Some people trust the FDA. Some people trust the CDC. Some people trust the World Health Organization. Some people trust their local minister. Some people trust someone else who says they're a professor and may be a professor, but who may have ideas that are very divergent from most of science, from most of the scientific community. And how do you work with a person who says, I believe in science, I watch YouTube videos, I'm not uneducated, I have been educated, I have taken in information. And you say, but you have taken in incorrect information. They say, well, you say it's incorrect. How do I know? Just as I said, how do I really know how my radio works? I just assume that people at the, you know, whoever's in charge of radios has figured that out. And I trust those folks. And I think this really comes down to trust. The people who have different views, many, not all, but many of the people that have radically different views from the mainstream scientific community in the United States today, I do not think are stupid or uneducated or anti-science. They are often intelligent. They are educated, but perhaps miseducated. They're educated on incorrect information. They are not anti-science. They are seeking science, but they don't recognize that this thing that I think is good science and a credible scientist is also what they recognize as good science and a credible scientist. And how to deal with that, I just don't know. I think that's a big issue, and it goes down to trust.
The failure of replication. You brought that up.
I think there is a problem that we do have in the community. Now, this is not new. Again, we want to talk about this as, is there some crisis? When people talk about a replicability crisis or a reproducibility crisis, the word crisis can have many meanings. It can mean a system that's about to collapse, right? You're in health crisis. You might die if we don't immediately bring your fever down or something. I see no evidence whatsoever that science is in crisis, that it's about to collapse, that it's failing to do its job. None. If we say crisis means things are much worse than they were before, I see no credible evidence that things are much worse than they were before in science. But if by crisis we mean something different, and by that we mean we have come to a point in history where we recognize that the current state of affairs, even if no worse than and maybe better than the prior state of affairs, is still not acceptable. And we have a groundswell of movement toward that. That's a crisis. In other words, it's a shared community view that says we'll no longer accept the current circumstances. We must up our game. And that is, I think, where we are as a scientific community now. We have accepted that there are threats and lesions in credibility, reproducibility, rigor, replicability, transparency that are unacceptable. Now, these are not new. For almost any problem you can show me that occurred in the last 5 years, I'm willing to bet that I can go back and find a highly similar scientific case that occurred 50 to 200 years ago that had the same kind of problem. If you want to show me a randomized controlled trial like the PREDIMED trial in the New England Journal of Medicine that grossly misrandomized or failed to randomize their subjects and therefore was invalid, a big trial of thousands of people and millions of dollars, I can show you the Lanarkshire milk experiment from the 1930s that the great student, as in William Gossett, student's t-test, failed to be randomized properly. 20,000 students, big data back from the 1930s. If you want to show me experimental error, Pons and Fleischmann, I can show you N-rays. And if you say, what are N-rays? I'd say, the reason you don't know about N-rays is because they don't exist. But 100 years ago, or thereabouts, Blondlot in Nancy, and as in Nancy, thought N-rays existed until Robert Wood went over to him and showed him that even if he palmed the prism that was supposedly an essential piece of the equipment to show N-rays, the N-rays still purportedly emerged. So we could go on and on and on like this, but we do need to up our game. So what do we see? We see that mistakes are not uncommon, and they range from the sublime to the ridiculous. They range from very challenging mathematical things, as in the famous hot hand fallacy, where things have gone back and forth saying, is there a hot hand in basketball or other similar sports? Whereby if you're on a streak, the fact that you, for example, got a free throw in now makes it higher probability that you get a free throw in next. And some of the most brilliant minds in the world, Nobel laureates, have fallen prey to some of these mathematical mistakes. Very subtle, very difficult things. That happens. It happened hundreds of years ago. It happens now. Then we see things that are ridiculous, like someone uploads the wrong data set. They ran a clinical trial at time 1, and then at time 2, they run another clinical trial, and they report at the new clinical trial, and they accidentally uploaded the old clinical trial data. That has happened. Or they say political conservatism is positively related to such and such trait. And then they find out that they accidentally scored it backwards. It was negatively related. This happens. So there are things like this, coding errors, happens all the time. These things are not new, but we need to do better. And so we need to make raw data more publicly available so people could check. We need to make the computer code publicly available so people could check. We need to have better ways of checking ourselves. In my own group, we won't send a paper out if we're the lead authors on it and have control over it. We will not send a paper out until a second statistician has picked up the data and the analysis that the first data analyst or statistician did and verified and replicated every single number in every line of text, in every figure, in every table. And we have never yet found a paper in which the first data analyst didn't make a mistake. Never. Now, when that first data analyst was a Ph.D. biostatistician, usually the mistakes are small. It's a little typo somewhere, a little transcription error. When the first person is not a Ph.D. level biostatistician or a professional statistician, sometimes the mistakes are quite severe. And so we always have a second statistician do it. So these are new things that are being done, but these things have led to concerns. So when the PREDIMED paper had to be retracted from the New England Journal of Medicine, people said that was one of the flagship papers in nutrition. That was one of the first paper in the field of nutrition that said we can actually show beneficial causal effects from a randomized controlled trial on hard endpoints, not just your weight, not just your cholesterol or your triglycerides, not your blood pressure, but hard endpoints like heart attacks and lifespan. And then to have that retracted and pulled out from under us because somebody screwed up the randomization is terrible. So these things have happened and we need to do better. And so many people are trying to work out ways, how can we do better? And why do we do worse? Well, there are many reasons: lack of statistical training, insufficient number of statisticians, lack of carefulness, lack of double checking, lack of putting the raw data out so that they can be double checked. But these are all things that as a community we're working on and we're going to make better and better. And I do think that when these things happen, they do unfortunately lead to losses of trust in the community, but hopefully we'll get them better and better and we can help the broad population understand that in fact, when we find these mistakes and fix them, it's a sign that science works well.
It's working.
Fix our errors. That's right. And one of the few things I feel a little bit embarrassed for myself in the field when somebody, including me, makes a foolish error, happens, but I don't feel horrible about it. What I feel really awful about is when an error is shown to exist and the person or persons who've made the error will not acknowledge and correct the error. We see that not uncommonly. And that, I think, is truly an egregious breach of ethics.
I think you've touched on, in a way, on is this worse? So let me tell you your fourth point, the incentives.
So one frequently hears the phrase perverse incentives. And they say, science has become a winner-take-all, hyper-competitive environment. And we need to get the deans and the chairs and the university administrators to start rewarding different things in promotion and tenure to promote better behavior, because otherwise people game the system. And if I get rewarded with promotion and tenure for big papers with novel, exciting findings in big journals, then I'm motivated to produce that, whatever it takes. Well, I think that's a very simplistic narrative. The first reason it's simplistic is less than 50% of scientists are in tenure track positions at universities now. So to say it's all about promotion and tenure is erroneous. And I say that as a dean, so I have to declare my conflict of interest. Right? So I'm one of those deans that people say, if only those deans would get it. Like, guys, we get it. So no dean that I know of puts all their eggs in that basket. But more importantly, as I said, less than 50% of scientists are in tenure track positions at universities. They work in government, they work in industry, they work in NGOs, or they work in universities not in tenure track. The second is it's not all about tenure promotion. There's also raises. What about all the full professors? You tell me because they're full professors who've already been tenured that there's no motivational systems in play? So to focus so much on tenure is just an oversimplification.
It distorts.
The second thing is that people talk about this idea of these perverse incentives. And the idea is if you say, well, look, if you get a big, exciting set of findings, you could win the Nobel Prize, or you could get your name in the New York Times, or you could get a big raise that year, or you could take this finding and go parlay it into a new NIH grant, which might help you get a raise. Again, these are all true, right? And people say is, if you dangle carrots in front of people, some people will, to put it politely, game the system. And some people, to put it impolitely, will plain lie, cheat, and steal carrots. And that's true. I don't think anybody who's ever seen humanity would say otherwise. But what we don't do, if you think about all the rest of life, we don't say there will be no more carrots in life. There will be no more incentives. We say, yes, these will create incentives for people to sometimes do badly. So the fact that we want to get to meetings on time sometimes means some of us are motivated to drive above the speed limit. But we don't say there'll be no more meetings or events that people want to get to on time.
On that point, I think you might get a disagreement. There is a reason to fight less meetings, for less meetings. So,
all right. But if I threw into meetings, parties, weddings, concerts, appointments to meet your fishing buddies and get on the boat, you would say, I think most people would say, we don't want to eliminate all those. And yet sometimes people will drive above the speed limit to get to those. What we do is other things, like we say, we'll give you points off your insurance if you don't get speeding tickets. We will say, if you get speeding tickets, you have to pay a fine. So there are other ways of mitigating the perverse incentives, as opposed to saying there will be no incentives anymore. Similarly, we don't say to runners at the Olympics, some of you might choose to take performance-enhancing substances. And so to avoid that, we're no longer going to reward people who get across the finish line first. Instead, we're just going to reward the people who look the nicest while they're running. That would defeat the whole idea of a running race. We say instead, we will check as best we can whether you're using illegal performance-enhancing substances. And we'll have penalties so that we disincentivize. Will some people sneak through? Yes. Will some people do it and get caught? Yes. And yet we haven't abandoned running, and we haven't abandoned giving gold medals out for the people who get across first. And so I think in science, it's very much the same thing. We need bold, big, risk-taking, exciting science. We need people to rush. We need people to work hard. Science is hard. Michael Strevens, in his new book called The Knowledge Machine, does a beautiful job of articulating this position. And he says, science is hard, it's long, and there's also a lot of luck involved. Right? Pasteur famously said, fortune favors the prepared mind. He said it in French, of course, but I'll do the English translation. And the idea is that a lot of it is luck, but not all of it is luck. And it's hard work just to enter the race, to have the chance to be lucky. And if we want people to do the hard work to enter the race, and we want people to do big, bold, risky science, which sometimes means you get laughed at because somebody says later your idea was stupid, or you fail. We need to have big rewards out there. And then we need to recognize that, yes, some people will game the system and some people will cheat, but we need countervailing incentives against that. We need to also incentivize people to do well. We need to give them the tools to do well, as Brian Nosek in the Open Science Framework does, as clinicaltrials.gov does, as other ways of depositing raw data do. We need to have gatekeepers like institutional review boards and animal care and use committees. So we have gatekeepers, we have tools, we have carrots, we have sticks. We don't want to just eliminate the carrots. We want big, bold, exciting science, and we want to mitigate the perverse incentives, not eliminate the incentives.
And I don't know that if I could have ever anticipated going from that to Dwight Eisenhower, but I'm going to, because in a certain sort of way, you've spoken very eloquently on the question of incentives. So let me go to something that stuck in my head a little bit. It's been more than 60 years ago when then President Eisenhower first invoked the term the military-industrial complex. He argued that there was a synergy of interest between persons charged with the defense of the country on the one hand, and the business and manufacturing firms that competed for what were then and are now huge contracts to design and build any and everything that the military might need. But also in the course of that speech, which has gotten substantially less emphasis, he also warned about the centrality of research as an integral part of the military-industrial complex. Eisenhower noted even then that a steadily increasing share is conducted for, by, or at the direction of the federal government. And he went on to suggest that partly because of the huge cost involved, a government contract becomes virtually a substitute for intellectual curiosity. You've and your colleagues have done a great deal in debating the influence of industry support for research. On the one hand, the kinds of research, especially in areas like nutrition, yours, the cost of doing research are substantial. And they far exceed, in most cases, what a university or an organization can put up. So in those cases, the industry itself often pays for the research. On the other hand, there are those people who say, almost by definition, the fact that someone sponsors your research skews your perspective, instills bias right into the process. How do you reconcile those two things, or is there reconciliation to be sought?
Once again, you've given me so much to work with. So let's talk a little bit about the need for certain kinds of research and the funding, and then let's jump over to the more esoteric theoretical aspects of the influence of that on decision making and I'll say decision making, tentative conclusion making, and less tentative conclusion making. So let's start with the idea of the need for multiple funders of research. I think it's absolutely essential. I think that there are people, or rather organizations, who will fund research that has no obvious short-term utility, beautiful or interesting, and might someday be shown to have amazing utility. It's often the case that occurs. And so we need sometimes a National Science Foundation, or a Simons Foundation, or a Sloan Foundation, or many other groups that will fund those kinds of things where you say, I don't know where this is going, but it's cool, it's interesting, it's new knowledge, it's beautiful, it's elegant science. We need that. We need others, like the Department of Defense, that says this is practical knowledge, and we need this, and we need it in the shorter term. It's still rigorous research. It's still government-based, not profit-based, but that doesn't mean unbiased or without motivation. Everybody's got motivations, right? The only people who don't have conflicts of interest are people who don't have interests, and people who don't have interests don't get out of bed in the morning, right? The only people I know who don't have interests are deceased people and catatonic people. Everybody else has interests, and then they have conflicts of interest.
So we're going to get calls and letters from Patagonia on that one, but that's all right. Go ahead.
Fair enough. So everybody has interests. Everybody has biases. That's okay. Science itself is a bias reduction process, as Adam Smith famously said, something to the effect of science is the antidote to the bias of superstition and enthusiasm. We all get enthusiastic about our ideas, and science is a way of trying to sift through that. Then we also need some kinds of research that are very, very practical, and sometimes may not even from a pure science point of view be actually all that interesting or important. But from another point of view, they may be important to someone else. So let's take an example here. I develop a new type of corn chip. And, I put a particular ingredient in that corn chip that's very well known to the scientific community to have some health benefit. No new knowledge here, right? But my corn chip is new. And as a manufacturer, I would like to claim that my corn chip will have this benefit. And the advertising regulators of the world say, if you want to claim that, you need to show it. And so I need legitimate science. Should the NIH fund this? Probably not. This is not an advance in science. We already know that ingredient is helpful. But in order to be able to say on my package, clinically proven to produce this thing, I've got to have the study. So who's going to fund that study other than the company that's going to sell that corn chip? No one. Should that company not be allowed to do their study? Should that company not be allowed to make their claim if it's true and they can demonstrate that it's true through a study? And so it's essential that we have many people doing this. And you might think corn chips are different. Somebody might say, we don't even need corn chips. Just, it's fine. Don't have corn chips. How about tires on cars? Would you like to know whether this new tire from the Michelin company is better than that old tire from the Goodyear company? There's only one way to find out. Do the experiment. As John Hunter famously said to Edward Jenner, the developer of the vaccine, do the experiment. And no one but the manufacturer is going to do that experiment. So these are important things to do. And so we need to recognize that we need to have those kinds of studies, but we need to have ways of dealing with the bias. And so that's why we have clinical trials registries. I think the data should be made publicly available whenever possible. The code should be made publicly available so that people can check. So that if I were to say to you, Dr. Skinner, I have some doubts. You were funded by the tire manufacturer. You could say to me, well, Dr. Allison, I accept your doubts. Let me show you.
Or the data.
Protocol that was time-stamped before I collected any data. Here are the raw data. You may have them and analyze them yourself. Here's the code I used to analyze them. Here are my records showing that these people, these drivers actually existed and that we actually ran these studies. Here's my reliability check on the speed checks or the tire, performance and so on. And then I think we say, now we've got legitimate checks. So this is, I think, the way to go. Now, so I think that these issues about people raising concerns about industry funding and bias are legitimate, but I think there's nothing special about industry. I think biases exist everywhere, and the antidote, as Adam Smith said, is the science itself. It's get the data out, show what you did. The process of science is what we should be relying on, not looking for more or less desirable souls. So, aha, I like you. I like the people you took money from. I don't like Holly. I don't like the people she took money from. That's the wrong way to go. It makes it about the person. It should be about the science and the process. All right.
I always like to remind everyone that Adam Smith was a moral philosopher too. So one last question then. We didn't go out and do a popularity contest about some of the things you and your colleagues have published and spoken about. But it doesn't seem totally unlikely that some of the studies that you cited as lacking in rigor, or some of the researchers who were unnamed, but at least they knew who they were, who produced research that was less than rigorous, or the organizations that sponsored the research who kind of wish maybe they had not panned out the way it did. So my sense was that this did not make you the most popular person in the world to bring these issues up. Now, I don't know that leadership automatically is identified with popularity, unpopularity, but I have to ask you, what's your motivation for this? You're not going to win a lot of friends by telling people, some of whom may be your peers for all I know, that, well, Ralph, that research you did was pretty frail stuff. Why is this so important to individuals? Not just you, it's not only you. Obviously, the academies have taken this up. Why is this so important now? And moreover, acknowledging what Karl Popper said years ago, that science is a social enterprise. It's something done by people with other people. And therefore, we're all going to be subjected to the same sorts of, concerns for popularity and being liked. Why do you want to undertake something that is not going to win you lots of friends?
Well, I have to say that I enjoy your question, but I will reject one element of the premise, which is that it doesn't win me lots of friends. So it actually does win me lots of friends. It just also wins me a few enemies. Right. So I'll try to answer in a few ways. The first is some of the why is just personality, right? I'm the kid who turned over the rock in the backyard and said, what's under here? And how did it get there? And are you sure? And what does it eat? And how do you know that that's true? And that's just me. Sometimes I get people will say to me, why did you choose to become a scientist? And I say, what makes you think I chose? I didn't choose to become a scientist. This is who I am. I don't have a choice. And so that's part of it. I think I'm skeptical by nature. I like to ask questions. Truth means a lot to me personally. I think it's sacred. And I don't mean that in a religious sense, but I mean that in a sense of the sacred honor. of truth. I think that is the one thing as scientists we must do. If somebody said to me, I must aim to decrease smoking, or I must aim to decrease obesity, or I must aim to end rural health disparities, I would say, as a scientist, if for your personal life, that's fine. But as a scientist, the one thing you must do is pursue and speak truth. That is what it means to be a scientist. If you are not pursuing and speaking truth to the extent that you know it, you are not being a scientist. Now, not everyone has to be a scientist, but if you say, I am, that's what it's about. It's the pursuit and the speaking of truth. I'm also consoled that when I look at people I admire throughout history, many of them have made enemies. In fact, all of them, the people I really admire, have made enemies. Whether it was Gandhi or Martin Luther King or Abraham Lincoln, these are some of the greatest people in history. Guess what? They had some pretty serious enemies, and I haven't been killed yet. I don't know that it won't happen someday, but hopefully I will play in slightly less dangerous fields than those three great historic people from history played in. But that's the nature of doing things that matter, that sometimes in doing things that matter, somebody's interests will not be perfectly aligned with what you do, and they will get angry at you. And I think if you want to make a difference in the world, you have to accept that. And so I accept that. I accept that not everybody will like me. I accept that sometimes some people will be my enemies or be angry at me. But I will also say that for every person who has said something negative to or about me, to my knowledge, non-random sample of who talks to me, but in the non-random sample of people who talk to me, there are far more who say, thank you for what you do.
We've learned two things right there. We've learned that you believe in predestination. Apparently, right out of the womb, you automatically started being a scientist. And secondly, we've learned something that I think we've tried to tell our clients often, that if you judge a candidate for a leadership position by how popular they are, you'll get one kind of candidate. It might be worth your time to ask them about their enemies. It's also a good way to find out about them. Dr. Allison, thank you very much. I hope that in some way or another, you won't stop this rather persistent behavior of yours, because it's the only way I know science ever gets better. Thank you for being on Innovators today.
I'm deeply grateful and honored, Dr. Skinner. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Innovators, a production of Harris Search Associates. We'll have more insightful conversations with global thought leaders to follow.